I discovered my husband's betrayal on a Tuesday afternoon, standing in our driveway as a stranger examined the ornate facade of our Victorian mansion. The woman's designer blazer and luxury car screamed real estate agent, but I hadn't listed our home for sale. My home, the one I had inherited from my grandmother, along with a trust fund my husband, Marcus, didn't know about. "Mrs. Reynolds?" The agent's voice carried across our manicured lawn. "I'm Caroline Matthews from Elite Properties. I'm here for the final walkthrough with our buyer." I kept my expression carefully neutral, years of corporate negotiations, serving me well. "Final walkthrough?" Caroline's perfectly penciled brows furrowed. "Yes, scheduled for 2 p.m. Mr. Reynolds confirmed it this morning. He said you'd be expecting us." Of course he did. Marcus, who had spent the last 5 years trying to convince me to sell my grandmother's legacy. Marcus, who had recently started taking suspicious phone calls in his home office. Marcus, who had insisted I spend the day at the spa, his treat, only for me to return early because of a migraine. "I apologize for any confusion," I said smoothly, retrieving my keys. "Please come inside." The foyer's crystal chandelier, original to the house, cast rainbow prisms across Caroline's shocked expression as I led her into my grandmother's pride and joy. Every antique, every carefully preserved detail reminded me of the strong woman who had raised me after my parents' deaths, the woman who taught me that power isn't about making noise, it's about knowing when to stay silent and observe. "Beautiful original hardwood," Caroline murmured, her heels clicking across the Brazilian cherry floors. The listing photos didn't do it justice. Listing photos. I filed that information away. "How long has the property been on the market?" "Just under a month." Caroline pulled out her tablet, fingers dancing across the screen. "Mr. Reynolds was quite motivated. The price point was aggressive, but it attracted immediate attention." "I bet it did. The house was worth well over $2 million in today's market." I wondered what price my husband had set in his eagerness to cash in on my inheritance. "And the buyer?" I kept my voice casual. "Dr. Elizabeth Chen." Caroline glanced up. "Brilliant neurosurgeon. She's relocating from Boston. The paperwork is nearly complete, just waiting on the final signatures." "Dr. Chen." The name tickled something in my memory, but I couldn't quite place it. I made a mental note to investigate later. My phone buzzed. Marcus, right on schedule, probably checking to make sure I was still tucked away at the spa, blissfully unaware that he was selling my house out from under me. I declined the call. "Would you excuse me for a moment?" I smiled at Caroline. "I need to make a quick call." In my grandmother's study, my study now, I closed the heavy oak door and pulled up my attorney's number. Rebecca had helped. My grandmother set up the original trust, ensuring the property would be protected. Time to see exactly how protected it was. "Catherine," Rebecca answered on the first ring, "I was just about to call you." "Let me guess," I said, watching through the window as another luxury car pulled into the driveway. "Someone's been making inquiries about the house's deed." "More than inquiries, Catherine. There's been an attempt to transfer ownership. The paperwork came through this morning." I thought of Marcus's recent late nights at the office, his sudden interest in my grandmother's old files, the mysterious calls. "Don't worry," Rebecca continued. "The trust's protections are ironclad. He can't sell what isn't legally his to sell." A tall, elegant Asian woman emerged from the car below, her bearing radiating quiet confidence. "Dr. Chen," I presumed. She paused, taking in the house's Victorian splendor, and I felt a sudden kinship with this stranger who clearly appreciated the property's historic beauty. "Rebecca," I said, a plan already forming. "Tell me everything about the attempted sale, and then I need you to contact Dr. Elizabeth Chen's office in Boston. Something tells me we might have more in common than an appreciation for Victorian architecture." Rebecca's investigation revealed a web of deception more intricate than I had imagined. Marcus hadn't just listed the house. He'd created a sophisticated paper trail complete with forged signatures and backdated documents. "Your grandmother's foresight is what saved you," Rebecca explained through my earpiece as I watched Dr. Chen examining the garden fountain. "The trust requires dual authentication for any property transfers. Marcus's forged signatures triggered immediate red flags." Dr. Chen ran her fingers along the fountain's marble edge, the same way I often did while thinking. She paused at my grandmother's favorite roses, her expression softening as she studied the heritage blooms. "What else did you find about our potential buyer?" I asked quietly. "Dr. Elizabeth Chen is something of a legend in neurosurgical circles, pioneered several groundbreaking procedures. But here's where it gets interesting. She's also known for exposing a major medical insurance fraud scheme last year. Took down an entire network of corrupt administrators." The memory clicked into place. I had read about her in the Wall Street Journal, the surgeon who had systematically dismantled a multi-million-dollar fraud operation while continuing to perform life-saving surgeries. A woman who knows how to multitask. "There's more," Rebecca continued. "She's been looking for this specific property for over a year, long before Marcus listed it. She tried to contact you directly several times." Messages I'd never received. I thought of Marcus's recent insistence on handling my correspondence, claiming I was too busy with my charity work. My phone buzzed again, Marcus's third attempt, in 20 minutes. This time I answered. "Darling?" His voice oozed concern. "How's the spa day? Feeling better?" I watched Caroline showing Dr. Chen the conservatory, where my grandmother had taught me her most valuable lesson. "Patience is the deadliest form of power." "Much better," I replied, matching his false sweetness. "In fact, I'm meeting someone very interesting at the house, Dr. Elizabeth Chen. Do you know her?" The sharp intake of breath on the other end was deeply satisfying. "Yeah, you're home, Catherine. Wait. She seems quite impressed with the property," I continued casually. "Though she mentioned the listing price seemed unusually low. What was it again?" "Catherine, listen. Sweetheart, I can explain." "I'm sure you can. Just like you can explain the forged documents, the intercepted messages, and the offshore account you opened last week." Rebecca's team had been thorough. "But right now, Dr. Chen and I have business to discuss." "Catherine!" I ended the call and turned back to the window. Dr. Chen stood at the koi pond, hands clasped behind her back, studying the house with the same analytical precision she likely brought to her surgeries. Yes, this woman would understand what I was about to propose. "Rebecca," I said, watching my husband's plans unravel before him. "Hold off on rejecting the property transfer. I think it's time Marcus learns what it feels like to be outplayed." Rebecca's tone carried a note of caution. "Catherine, what are you thinking?" I smiled, watching Dr. Chen notice the subtle Asian influences my grandmother had incorporated into the garden design. "I'm thinking," I replied, "that sometimes the best way to deal with a thief is to let them think they've succeeded." My client was merely exploring financial options when your client, Rebecca, interrupted, forging signatures, falsifying property records, and attempting to sell a house he didn't own. The trust's legal team has documented at least 17 separate felony violations. I observed from my grandmother's chair, remembering how she taught me the power of silence in negotiations. Elizabeth remained by the window, her analytical gaze missing nothing. "The offshore accounts complicate things," Detective Chen noted. Though no relation to Elizabeth, he was equally sharp. "Cross-border financial fraud carries additional penalties." Marcus's attorney wiped his brow. "Perhaps we could discuss a plea arrangement." "That depends," I interjected smoothly, "on full cooperation and complete disclosure, starting with the location of my grandmother's missing journals." The room stilled. Marcus's face twitched. a tell he'd never learned to control. "I don't know what you're talking about," he attempted, but his voice lacked conviction. "The leather-bound journals from the library safe," I clarified. "The ones documenting her investment strategies and business contacts. They disappeared shortly after you began planning this little venture." Elizabeth moved from her window post, her heels clicking deliberately across the hardwood. "Regina's research journals? The ones containing her medical investment insights?" Marcus's eyes darted between us, calculating. I could almost see him weighing his options, wondering if the journals might serve as bargaining chips. "Amanda has them," he finally admitted. "In her apartment?" We thought, they might be valuable." "More than you know," Elizabeth commented quietly. "Those journals detailed revolutionary approaches to medical technology investments. Regina was decades ahead of her time." I nodded to Detective Morris, who spoke quietly into his radio. Within minutes, we'd have the journals secured. Now I turned back to Marcus. "About the property listing." His attorney straightened. "Given the circumstances, we'll naturally withdraw." "Actually," I interrupted, "I'm inclined to proceed with the sale." Marcus's head snapped up. His attorney blinked in confusion. "Catherine," Rebecca cautioned. "Not at Marcus's ridiculous price, of course," I continued. "But Dr. Chen's original offer, the one she attempted to submit 3 months ago, was quite fair." Understanding dawned in Elizabeth's eyes. "You want to honor Regina's wishes." Well, my grandmother believed in legacy, in passing things to those who would preserve and build upon them. I met Elizabeth's gaze. "She chose you as her medical protege. Perhaps she'd appreciate you stewarding her home as well." "This is ridiculous," Marcus burst out. "You can't just—" "Actually, she can," Rebecca interjected. "The trust gives her full discretion over property transfers. And given your documented fraud, you have no standing to object." Detective Chen's radio crackled. "Units at the girlfriend's apartment have recovered the journals, along with several other items of interest from the house." More pieces of my heritage Marcus had attempted to liquidate, no doubt. I made a mental note to do a full inventory. "Well then," I stood, smoothing my skirt. "Detective Morris, I believe you have what you need for the fraud charges. Rebecca, please proceed with both the divorce filing and the property transfer paperwork, the legitimate one this time." Marcus's attorney touched his arm, warning him to remain silent. But Marcus, never one to recognize a losing battle, couldn't help himself. "You've been planning this," he accused. "All this time playing the quiet wife, you were just waiting." "No, Marcus. You planned this. Every forged document, every secret account, every betrayal, those were your choices. I simply made sure they had consequences." Elizabeth approached the desk, her presence somehow both professional and warmly familiar. "Regina would be proud," she said quietly. "She always said true power lies in letting others underestimate you." I thought of my grandmother, of all. Her lessons about patience and strategy. Speaking of which, "Would you like to explain the second offshore account?" I asked. "The one you thought I wouldn't find?" The color drained from his face as Detective Chen pulled out a fresh notepad. "Sometimes the best revenge isn't just exposing a betrayal, it's ensuring every single layer of it comes to light." As Detective Chen methodically traced its connections, a pattern emerged, one that transformed Marcus from an opportunistic fraudster into something far more calculated. 6 shell companies, Rebecca detailed, spreading documents across my grandmother's desk. All linking back to a holding company in Singapore. He's been siphoning funds for at least 3 years. I studied the financial web, noting familiar names among the transaction records. "These are my charity's major donors." "Were," Elizabeth corrected, analyzing the data with clinical precision. "He redirected their contributions through his network. The real estate fraud wasn't the end game. It was just his latest scheme." Detective Morris had stepped out to coordinate with the white-collar crimes unit, while Detective Chen continued unraveling the financial labyrinth. "The pattern matches other cases we've investigated," she observed. "Target wealthy women, preferably those with established charitable foundations. The foundations provide cover for moving money internationally." My hands clenched beneath the desk. 3 years of donor trust betrayed. 3 years of intended charitable work diverted into Marcus's private accounts. "The hospitals," Elizabeth said suddenly, pulling up records on her tablet. "The neurosurgery grants Regina established. They were supposed to be receiving quarterly funding." I accessed the Foundation's records, anger building as I cross-referenced the data. Reduced to minimal payments, just enough to avoid suspicion, the rest diverted through Singapore. "Along with funding for the children's cancer research, the scholarship program, and the historical preservation grants," Rebecca finished, grimly. Detective Chen's phone buzzed. She checked it, her expression hardening. "Amanda's talking. Apparently, there are more accounts." Marcus's attorney whispered urgently in his client's ear, but the fight had left Marcus's eyes, replaced by the hollow realization that his house of cards was collapsing. "I want to see them," Elizabeth said quietly, indicating my grandmother's recovered journals. An evidence officer had just delivered them, carefully preserved in sealed bags. I nodded permission, understanding her connection to these pieces of Regina's legacy. As Elizabeth reverently examined the journals, I turned back to the financial records. "Here," Detective Chen pointed to a series of transactions. "He used the diverted charity funds as seed money for private investments, medical, technology companies, pharmaceutical startups, direct competitors to the research programs the Foundation was supposed to be funding." Elizabeth looked up, horror dawning. Regina documented these companies in her notes. She considered them ethically questionable. The pieces aligned with sickening clarity. Marcus hadn't just stolen money, he'd actively undermined my grandmother's healthcare initiatives, profiting from the very problems she'd dedicated her life to solving. "Then we have work to do," I said, gathering the financial records, "starting with rebuilding everything he tried to destroy." Elizabeth smiled, a hint of my grandmother's determination in her expression. "Regina always said the best restoration projects require surgical precision." I realized this was just the beginning. Sometimes, discovering a betrayal isn't the end of the story. It's the start of something far more important. The competing private company had received mysterious new funding through companies they controlled.